what they brought me up here to talk to you about today is I'm not a technologist. I'm here to ask with you, what do we think the future of war is? What is our technology? What's our purpose, our strategy, our policy serving? So join me on a thought journey, and we'll take Q&A at the end. Now I'm going to sort of do this TED Talk styles without notes. We'll see how it goes. So it's very easy to ask, are we ready for the future of war? What are our assumptions, right? We know this guy blew it a year ago. Russia's badass stock went way down in the last year. Not good for Ukrainians, we're trying to help them. Because it always turns out war is really difficult to predict. The only real rule is the rule of unintended consequences. And the enemy gets a vote too. Now it's easy to ridicule a little bit, maybe a lot of it, Putin. But how much better are we? If I was to ask you, when was the last major war the US won, what would you say? Civil War. That's controversial. Okay, how about a little bit more recently than Civil War? With partners, I don't know. It's up to you. Big war, though. World War II is the answer. World War II. Some would say Gulf Storm 1 or 1991, although I would argue not really. The plan was never leave, which has been the case. I would say, honestly, it's World War II, if we're honest with ourselves. Yet we have the best military in the world. Even our adversaries acknowledge that. We have the best military in the world. So the question is, what's the problem? What is the problem? We have the best military, yet we haven't won a war in 70 years. Something's the problem. The answer up front is this. We have what I call victor's curse. You've heard this saying that generals always fight the last war, especially if they won it. Actually, I should ask, are there any generals in the room right now? Okay, I don't mean you, obviously, right? This is victor's curse. Now, rather than picking our country, let's look at a case study. Let's get into our time machine. Let's go back 100 years to this war. One of the most brutal wars in history. Now, when it was done, France had a bad case of victor's curse. This is the Treaty of Versailles. Clemenceau, the president of France, is the guy in the middle with a bushy white mustache. And, Clemenceau and French High Command assumed the future of war would look just like the last one, but with better technology. So they thought the future of war would be more trench warfare and attrition. So what did they invest in as their super weapon in the interwar years? I know it, I can hear it. Exactly, the Maginot Line. One of the greatest military fortification systems in history, and it still is amazing. I'm sure some of you have been there. You go out to Verdun and so forth. It is incredible. I mean, all these bunkers at tactical and strategic positions along the border with underground railroads and hospitals and barracks and everything else, with a chemical warfare and biological warfare component to it as well. But there's just one problem with the Maginot Line. We know what that is. It was already obsolete in World War II. The Germans changed their way of warfare. Not just the technology, but how they organized, how they fought, how they resupplied, how they did everything. And they easily outflanked the Maginot Line. And what they couldn't do in 4 bloody years of World War I, they achieved in just 6 days of World War II. So here's the problem with victor's curse, and war futurists in general, is that they all think they're looking forward, but most of them are looking in the rear view mirror. If I was to ask you what is in our country's rearview mirror, what might you say? Vietnam, I would say World War II. World War II. I mean, look at Hollywood. Every year, there are more World War II movies being produced. There are more World War II movies than all other American war movies combined. Think of Saving Private Ryan. That is our paradigm, both in American culture, but also in American strategic culture too. There is a saying from business that culture eats strategy for breakfast. What this means is that our strategic culture can eclipse our strategic IQ. Our paradigm, our confirmation bias can get in the way of innovative thinking. And we see this in Washington today. If you want to know what the strategic paradigm is, when the people say great power competition, or now strategic competition, because you know buzzwords have to change, it's this, it's World War II. It's conventional war. It is, you know, wargaming has become a cottage industry now inside the Beltway. Done not just by the DoD, but by think tanks. And they're all doing Straits of Taiwan. And they imagine the Battle of Midway in Straits of Taiwan fought with Ford-class carriers and F-35s. And my point is, that stuff is obsolete. It's as obsolete as Putin's blitzkrieg into Ukraine, which failed. And he went to irregular warfare in March and April. We imagine the future of war that is like World War II, our strategic paradigm, with better technology. And this is dangerous. And the reason it's wrong is because of you all, that you know this. When great powers have WMD, it makes the conventional war phase either very short or obsolete. All these war games have this artificially prolonged conventional war phase, and when everything else is exhausted, only then does somebody go nuclear or use chem bio or something like that. And in reality, that could happen in a few hours, not a few weeks or months, or at all for some of them. So let's take a step back. Now, this graph is now obsolete as of yesterday. We spend more in our DoD than the next 11 biggest militaries in the world combined. And now it's going to be next year up to $858 billion, which is almost, far more than Saudi Arabia's GDP. So if we want to figure out what is our vision of the future of war, not us in this room, but us in the national security establishment, it's actually not hard to determine. All you got to do is look at what we're investing in, what weapon systems we are buying. Because we're placing bets on the kind of, what tools we need for the next generation of warfare. And these tools take a long time, as you know, to develop, as you know very well. So if you look at the top 10 programs, weapon acquisitions programs, they're probably not yours. I could be corrected on this. They go to places like Lockheed and General Dynamics, and they're things like this, the F-35. Does anybody know how much the F-35 program will cost allies and taxpayers? Just throw out some numbers. $7 trillion? That's pretty high, even for me. Okay, how about others? $50 billion. No, you must not work in acquisitions. What else? $700 billion? Okay, I like this audience. No, it's $1.7 trillion on a single-seat airplane. How many, and to give you, see, I'm a liberal arts major, so to give you a sense for how big that is, how many zeros, that is more money than Russia's GDP, right? In fact, if this airplane were a country, its GDP would be ranked 11th in the world, ahead of Saudi Arabia and Brazil and other places. You know, and I'm an old infantry guy, so how many combat missions does this plane have? We've been at war for 20 years, at least one place. Take a guess how many combat missions? Zero. Zero combat missions. So as an old paratrooper, we'd say, that dog don't hunt, right? That dog don't, and we're buying a lot more. And it's not just this, it's Ford-class carriers. They cost over $13 billion a copy. We're building 3, we're ordering 2 more. And we're worried that if there's actually a shooting war with China, they'll end up in the bottom of the South China Sea within 20 minutes. So this is our version of the Maginot mentality, assuming future wars will look like past successful ones, even though we have lots of evidence that conventional war is pretty much over and dead. If you look at all the armed conflicts since World War II, only 6% of them are conventional wars. Everything else is what we call a regular war. Okay, so if the future is not conventional, and of course DoD kind of thinks it is, what does the future really look like? The future of war is getting sneakier. It's getting sneakier. Now, why is warfare getting sneakier? Because geopolitics is getting sneakier because we live in the information age. We live in a world where everybody has some version of this, and they can become a reporter, a journalist, a videographer, a director, a publisher, all at once, anywhere in the world. In a world, and we will continue to live in an information age unless there's some sort of nuclear Armageddon, right? And in an information age, information becomes a center of gravity that rivals lethality when determining winners and losers in war. So let me explain how you win in an information age like this. I'll do it at the 3 levels of war. As you know, there's the tactical, the operational, and the strategic level of war. I'm going to start, how do you win at the strategic level of war? So to do it at the strategic level of war, it's this. You offer societies covertly a blue pill versus red pill choice. Modern war is becoming epistemological. Epistemology is the philosophy of how do you know what you know is true. So rather than invade a country, rather than China making Omaha Beach here in San Francisco, it's just much easier to reach into a country through disinformation and other means and stir it up. You find an existing cleavage in society and you throw kerosene on it, light it on fire, fan it, and pull it apart. The red versus blue wars in our country. In this type of world, a new WMD comes to mind. For example, this is just one as a deep fake. Now I'm going to show you a really old deep fake from 2016. Some of you have probably seen it. Modern ones are very hard to detect.
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson is in the sunken place, or, how about this, simply, President Trump is a total and complete dipshit. Now, you see, I would never say these things, at least not in a public address, but someone else would. Someone like Jordan Peele. This is a dangerous time. Moving forward, we need to be more vigilant with what we trust from the internet. It's a time when we need to rely on trusted news sources. It may sound basic, but how we move forward in the age of information is going to be the difference between whether we survive or whether we become some kind of fucked up dystopia. Thank you. And stay woke, bitches.
Deep fakes are not something that can only be made in Caltech labs. You can go on the internet today and make your own. You can make fake Twitters, fake everything. Everything is fakeable. Everything is frameable. This is a new type of weapon of war, if you want to think of it that way. So again, what I call like old school war, what is called traditional warfare or conventional warfare in the Pentagon, you won sort of, in the Clausewitzian manner of you captured or killed more enemy troops, you took more territory, and you flew your flag on the enemy's capital. But today, this is how you win. One way you win is through disinformation, hacking elections. And it's not just ours, it's across the European Union. And here's the strategic logic. If you can pick and choose leaders, who cares about the sword if you can manipulate the mind that wields it? Who cares about how many Ford-class carriers you have if you have a POTUS who is fundamentally wants to, work with you versus work against you, or something like that? In fact, we can even question the validity of battlefield victory. Is it even relevant anymore? In 2003, we achieved perfect battlefield victory over the Iraq forces, totally irrelevant for the outcome of the Iraq War. I mean, to be candid about it, winning battles and losing wars has become an American tradition over the last 50 years. And I'm not blaming the military for that. I blame, frankly, our strategic IQ above us. That's just my opinion, though. So here's how you win. It's not that we're going to have a Berlin 1945 moment where Russia and China invade and it's, we're going to be occupied. It's this. It's that others use disinformation and other things to take an existing problem, stir it up, and they let us tear our own throats out, saving them the trouble of doing so. And their victory condition is not that we go away like Nazi Germany, it's that we deflate. It's that we become a first world country without first world power, like, say, for example, Italy. Any Italians here? I hope I should have checked that too. Anyway, yeah. You see what I'm saying, or maybe Austria or something like that. Okay, so, and also, as you know, how does it defend itself against disinformation and not become an autocracy in the process? This is why autocracies like to do this to democracies. All right, now, at the operational level of war, how do you win? You win this way. You win by waging war, but you disguise it as peace to your enemies, right? Through trickery, through cunning. So here's some examples of today waging war but disguising it as peace to your enemies. Belt Road Initiative by China. It's more than an economic policy. It's like they Tony Soprano people out of their stuff. Ask Sri Lanka. They use incredible political pressure. They're getting countries to face towards Beijing and away from Washington. They use this like a cudgel. Some argue that it's not really debt trap diplomacy, but it's a healthy debate. It's certainly not just economics. Weaponizing migrants. Russia does this all the time on the border of the EU. For example, in 2016, they bombed civilian centers in Syria like Aleppo. This helped create a flood of refugees that ended up in the European Union that resulted in the Brexit. The old Politburo would have loved for such a strategic outcome because they've always tried to break up the European Western Bloc. That's their operational goal. Salami slicing, as well as cyber. I mean, how many times have we been to a cyber conference where they spend over half the time asking, is it an act of war or not? We've been asking that for 25 years. At some point, we should just get over it, right? And we could keep on going on. There's all sorts of things that our adversaries do that don't fit neatly into our paradigm of warfare. and conventional war, which is why they do it. They're neither war nor peace. And we create these buzzwords to help wrap our head around it, like gray zone and hybrid, but it's all like watching a dog picking up a basketball. Doesn't work very well. All right, so here they're using our strategic paradigm against us. It's a very Sun Tzuian concept, like jujitsu. All right, now at the tactical level of war, you use plausible deniability, not firepower. If you contrast, Russia had a lot more success in 2014 than they did in 2022. One of the big reasons is because they used ways and means that afforded the maximum plausible deniability, such as Spetsnaz special forces, little green men, mercenaries like the Wagner Group, these AstroTurf separatists, Russian separatist units that were controlled by the GRU, and loads of active measures and propaganda. They created a ghost occupation. They created the fog of war, and these units slithered through it. And while the West was still scratching its head, figuring out what were the facts on the ground in eastern Ukraine, the Crimea was a fait accompli. And only then did Putin pull back the curtain and said, hey, it was us all along, we lied to you. And only then did the conventional war weapons like tanks and destroyers show up. They had no real role in taking Crimea. They were just sort of the cherry on top. And it's not just this example, it's all sorts of things. So China is doing this in the South China Sea. When they surround an island that they want to take, and they have this something called the cabbage tactics, so they have concentric circles of naval vessels. The first and inner circle are these Chinese fishing fleets of like little blue men. These are civilians, but inside those boats are Chinese naval radios, and they take command and control from admirals. They're being controlled by the Navy. And here, China is essentially blurring the line between civilian and combatant, deliberately manipulating the laws of armed conflict for advantage. Mercenaries, a year and a half ago, mercenaries assassinated the standing president of Haiti. Now, we caught the mercenaries, but we don't know who hired them. They don't know who hired them. And that means that somebody got away with killing a president. And success is imitated around the world. And Libya is an example of a modern conflict. We can talk about this, but for almost 12 years now, that conflict has been going on. We don't know who's on the ground and who they're fighting for and why. But sometimes it goes into mainstream news, but then it quickly goes back by all sides into the shadows, into plausible deniability. Meanwhile, those who try 1940 tactics like blitzkrieging, this is remember that 40-mile convoy that was, quote, moving into Kiev in March, was stuck on the road? That's a symbol of how conventional war does not work today. There are much more easy ways to achieve your strategic ends than trying to do this, which requires, the organizational skill of a Fortune 50 CEO. So what does victory look like? If war is trending into secrecy, into sneakiness, how do you win? What does it look like? Well, it may surprise you, and that's the point. So let me ask a question of everybody in this room. When was the last time anybody here saw a Hollywood movie with a Chinese villain? Never? I mean, we have we have Russian villains, terrorist villains. We even have American villains. Yeah, down here. Big Trouble in Little China. Okay, all right. I know we're in San Francisco. This millennia. Let's keep it to this millennia. Rush Hour, that's the 1990s, right? All right, that's a good one, but now in this millennia, isn't it bizarre? Isn't it bizarre? Is that a coincidence? No, it's not. They bought Hollywood legally. Earlier, we were talking about the power of influence in WMDs. This is a new type of WMD. They bought it legally. You know, in the movies, in the pre-credits before the actual movie starts, you have all those studio pre-credits. Next time, look for any of that are in Mandarin, right? Or Legendary Studio. Legendary Studio is like it's like Huawei. It's owned by Beijing, right? And if you are, and I'm a novelist, I work occasionally with Hollywood. If you submit a script that has a Chinese villain, nobody will touch you. It's toxic. Nobody will touch you. Because even if you're not owned by China, just say you're like Sony Studios, who doesn't have a real, affection for Beijing. If you want your movie to show in China, which is the second largest movie market in the world, you want to make money, you have to submit it to Beijing censors. And they do censor it heavily. You should all know that, right? Now, this is not just a movie thing. This is a soft power play where they're always the good guy. So who saved the day in The Martian? Does anybody recall? Chinese NASA saves the day in The Martian, right? They're always the good guy. Now, how about this? How many people have seen Wolf Warrior or Wolf Warrior 2? Nobody? This movie made over $800 million worldwide, which is like George Clooney money. And it didn't even show in the United States, which is the biggest movie market in the world. And not because it was censored. When I tell you the plot, you'll figure out why they didn't show it here. So this movie is an action movie because, China's trying to build their own Hollywood to eclipse ours someday, they hope. So did anybody can remember the original Rambo movie, the very first one? It's actually a really good movie. The ones after it, were terrible. But the first one, it's like Rambo. The guy in the top here is like this Chinese special forces dude, like the best of the best. And like Rambo, he's got a heart of gold, but doesn't take to authority very well. Maybe some of you colonels out there will commiserate with that. Delegates who, subordinates who do that. And he's watching CCTV someday, and he sees this guy here who runs an American private military company in Africa, beating up and preying on local Africans and also Chinese people who are in Africa helping them. And he goes over there and launches his own one-man ass-kicking show. And at the end, has a big boss fight with the American who's on fire here. And, kicks ass and blows up the American, literally. And everybody in the theater goes, woohoo! It's like as if the Death Star had been blown up, right? And that, in this movie, America is clearly vilified. Now, some of you are thinking, well, that's a dirty private military contractor like Blackwater. Who cares? So be it. I got news for you. The only people in the world who distinguish between Blackwater and Marines are Americans. The rest of the world, there's no distinction. They're just, white guys and beards and muscles running around Baghdad or whatever. And so this is a stand-in for troops, for US troops. This is influence. Now I see some thought bubbles. I don't have many superpowers. The only superpower I have are reading some people's thought bubbles. And some people are like, okay, McFate, that's fine, but I work for the Department of Defense. This is a strange music, film theory class taken across the street to San Francisco College or something. And my response is this. This is a durable form of strategic victory. If all of our grandkids speak Mandarin as a second language and are sympathetic to Beijing values, that is durable victory. It's what we did to Germany, or West Germany, after World War II. Germany, that war did not end in 1946. It did not end in Nuremberg. By the time the Berlin Wall fell down in 1989, all West Germans spoke English as a second language and were sympathetic and remain sympathetic to American values. That is durable victory. This is something that F-35s alone cannot achieve. So here's the problem with sneaky war. is that I imagine it sort of like, it's like a soccer penalty shootout where autocracies can fight this way very easily. They're not accountable to voters. They manipulate the media. They manipulate their economic sectors. They don't care about laws of armed conflict or rule of law. They do anything they want to do. Whereas democracies, rule of law societies that are open, with open elections, we're like the goalie, and we can be very good, but no goalie is perfect. And this is why sneaky war is becoming a way of warfare in the 21st century, not just because we live in an information age, but because of regime type as well. So autocracies can fight this way very easily. It's one reason that they are continuously on the rise. And we struggle to how do we resort counter this. In fact, you could argue that we are already at war with Russia and or China and don't know it, and that's by their design. It's the boiling the frog slowly strategy. In the Cold War, everybody knew the Soviets, with Armageddon, nuclear Armageddon around the corner, or biological or chemical Armageddon around the corner, that was a unifying threat. Here, they disguise the threat to keep Americans and Europeans and other democracies from sort of coalescing around a threat set. So I'll leave the rest for some questions here, but maybe the best way to counter this is that we should consider getting into the dark arts again ourselves, something that we used to do in the Cold War, not always with success, but not always without success either. Because currently the status quo doesn't seem to be working. Putting more aircraft carrier groups in the South China Sea is not deterring China from expanding there or from saber rattling with Taiwan. Our big military and F-35s are not keeping Russia out of its neighbor's backyard. So maybe we should do some of these dark arts ourselves, not imitate Russia, but some version that we can call our own. And I can get into Q&A about some examples of that, just sort of off the record, just more like brainstorming. But before we get too excited about that, let's also remember this. We learned in the 1970s from the Church Committee that secrets and democracy are not compatible. Now, as war gets sneakier and more secretive, I'm not advocating that, I'm observing it. How do democracies fight sneaky wars and not lose their democratic soul in the process? Like, that's the number one national security question I think we should be wrangling with today, not how many Ford-class carriers we require. But before we just say, oh, we shouldn't be doing it, we should ask ourselves this question. What happens if we don't try? Having some problems with the... All right. What happens if we do not try? And lastly, and I'll leave you with this, and let's go to Q&A. Is it really somehow better to lose honorably than to win dishonorably? Okay, with that, let's go to Q&A. It's open season. Anything you wish. Thank you. All right. Security cooperations. I think so. So right now, the go-it-alone attitude that we saw at the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003 led to bad places. And we'd be foolish to think that we can go it alone. We need to develop allies, and let's be honest with ourselves. China and Russia have no natural allies, unless you consider the Cossacks with Russia a natural ally. These are old empires, centuries old, and their neighbors generally hate their guts for centuries. That's something that we should exploit. Let's prop up some of the republics on their borders with security force assistance so they can be a thorn in the side of those countries so that we don't have to. And the grand strategy here is if you want China out of the South China Sea or you want Russia out of places like Ukraine, you get them more interested in their domestic security situation, and they will voluntarily pull out of expeditionary warfare. And that happens in part by working with allies. So I think absolutely allies are a critical element to our mutual fight. All right. All right, so this is the question everybody wants to know. I should be asking you this question, especially, so I don't know. Honestly, we've all seen the pundits. Let's not forget that many of the same pundits expected that there would be no war in Ukraine, and that when the war kicked off, that it would be over in a matter of days, right? We've seen these pundits, a lot of them are ex-military on Fox and CNN. I don't know, and here's the reason I honestly don't know, and maybe some of you have better ideas than me, is that autocracies like Russia are not run by political institutions, they're run by individuals. And because of that, unless we can get inside of Putin's head, we don't know what his trigger point will be. We also don't know, we could try to guesstimate, or we could try to engineer a palace coup, either by the right wing or left wing, and they may have a different answer to this question. And of course, Putin has been walking it back a bit in recent days, but ultimately it's hard to know. And it's also because it's hard to know where Putin's ego ends and Russian foreign policy begins. So it's a great question. What would happen? I don't know. I will say this, is I think the Ukraine war is going to go on for a while. I don't think it's going to end in the spring or the summer. I think it's going to go on for quite some time. How about next question? Okay, Ukraine. Social media. Okay, so I think this is important because it shows the power of information. So in my book, The New Rules of War, I kind of lay out, hey, warfare is changing. There's these 10 new principles or ideas or rules of war about how to win. The first rule is conventional war is dead, which, got some attention in the Pentagon. Rule number 5 is that the best weapons don't fire bullets, and I talk about the power of information. And I think Zelensky and the Ukrainians have been masterful at, outflanking Russia, the disinformation superpower, outflanking them on the information fight. We all remember Snake Island with the Ukrainians doing this to that, the Moskva, the capital ship. Of course, it turns out that was totally fake, but it doesn't matter. The meme stuck, it had its impact. And it's not just ephemeral. When Zelensky said, or is attributed to saying his famous quote, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition," when apparently the US and others are like, we'll help get you out of Ukraine. He's like, nope. That resulted in more ammunition. It's amazing to think, how many people thought like in March that the West would have Ukraine fatigue by June, but we haven't. And part of it has to do with their information feed and their disinformation feed at that as well. So I think it shows that information is as important at winning wars at all 3 levels of war as is lethality. Arguably more important. That's a debate. Next question. All right, how do we focus a nation to see this problem? Oh, that's a hard one. Okay. Oh, that's by Colonel Grease. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Okay, so it's a great question. So I was just briefing at SMU at Fort Belvoir just on Tuesday, and they asked the exact same question. Hey, we know there are problems with the military-industrial complex, how it makes us want things we ought not to want. And there's examples where the CNA, the admiral in charge of the Navy, is like, we don't need more F-35s, we need some more F-18s with these capabilities. And the Congress is like, nope, you're having F-35s, right? And so what that results in is not just a ginormous DoD budget, which, it's for us in some ways, it's obviously very good. We're all DoD employees. But there are problems with it, and we have what we call means-driven strategy. You're a JTF commander, and you've got to do something, and rather than saying, hey, here's the problem set, and how do we deal with it, you're like, well, we have a bunch of aircraft carriers and F-35s and some drones. Let's try to figure out a way to use them. And that's not the smartest way. Now, I do talk to, so sneaky war, the other problem is, the first problem is military-industrial complex. The second problem is that less than 1% of our country serves in uniform. And what that means is that most Americans are pretty detached from national security as we see it on the ground. And that creates moral hazard in public policy making. I think you could argue Brittany Griner might be an example of that. So what I'm doing in some ways is I'm spitting in the wind. I'm trying to raise awareness because for a victorious nation to change its way of war usually requires a lot of blood. But sometimes that doesn't work, as we saw with Clemenceau and the French, right? So the best I can do is talk and engage, and what I'm discovering is this, is that there's an intellectual insurgency in the DoD. Conventional war might be the top sort of layer of how DoD and national security establishment sees the future of war, but there's plenty of people at all places and ranks and GS grades who see something that looks a little bit more like this. I also see there's a generational rift. So, troops that enter the military, say after 9/11, are much more sympathetic to this versus, say, troops who entered in the 1980s during the end of the Cold War. They view me, and those are most of our 3 and 4 stars. And they, so my reaction when I talk, I give some version of this around the world, the new rules of war, is that people either want to say that is amazing, let's do more of that, or they're like, get out the wood, get out the rope, we'll burn them at the stake. One of those two, usually. But I think that this has to be like an intellectual insurgency. And there's lots of other people out there. I am one of many voices. All right, other questions? Elon Musk. Yes, so this is a great question. All right, so one of the things I didn't include I want to have lots of time for Q&A, but I usually have when I talk about what American sneaky war could look like, I usually have some like 8 or 9 examples of what that could look like. And one of the examples is Starlink, because, autocracies, they build their regime on a pile of lies for their own internal political legitimacy. I mean, think of Russia, think of North Korea, think of, Xi Jinping, all of them. And so we don't need to have a counter narrative to challenge that political narrative they have. We just got to have them be able to Google whatever the hell they want. So either it's pirate VPNs or stuff like Starlink is very powerful. Because right now, we can all see one of the scenarios is that Putin, he fails to deliver his promise to the Russian people and is replaced. But the problem is that you have now multinational corporations and individuals who are more powerful than most states. And in the book, The New Rules of War, one of my rules, I think it's rule number 8 or 7, is that there will be non-state superpowers. Because if you look at the rise of mercenaries around the world, which is one of the rules, combined with Fortune 500 and very wealthy people, you're going to have wars without states. I mean, the problem that we have in our government is that we're very state-centric. And we always think about the 25 strongest states, not the bottom 160 weakest states, right? And then, when ExxonMobil goes into the Gulf of Guinea in Africa, they are a political player. They hire private CIAs. They can hire private mercenaries. You can hire Mi-24 attack Hind helicopters on the mercenary market or special forces groups, to do anything you want to do. And we're going to go to a point now where in the future you'll have Enterprise 1 versus Enterprise 2 battling in Katanga for gold mines, and states are just booty to be won. And we see this already in Latin America. We call them narco-states. So I think that we have to break our state-centric thinking and think about how do we live in a world in the middle of the 21st century where private actors have as much, if not more power than most states, not all, most states. That world will look a lot more like the 12th century than the 20th. But we are stuck on the 20th century, because that's what we kind of know. Other questions? Yeah. All right, increasing. All right, how does, oh boy, how do we do sneaky war without compromising its industrial capabilities and economy? Well, that's a great question too. I think first of all, as you all know, the DoD has just recently woken up to supply chain security as a big problem, right? How do we do that? The second is that here's an area that our 4 stars and our political leadership needs some strategic help, and maybe you can help them with this. Economic warfare is one of the oldest forms of warfare, but we never did it in the Cold War. Why? Because there were 2 economic blocks. There was the communist bloc and the free trade bloc. Now we are all in one big block, a free trade bloc. And economic warfare will become a thing again. It will become a thing again. And there will be winners and there will be losers. And I don't, I'm not sure how we engage in answering this question, because I think it's going to be a little bit like a bull in a china shop initially at first. So I think this is a huge risk. And I don't think we're going to have nationalized economies like pre-Bretton Woods. We're not going to have nationalized economies again. So we might go that way, but it's a great question without an easy answer. Right. So what are my thoughts on American businesses expanding overseas? Okay, this is a great question too. There's another theory of global expansion, which is, the flag follows trade. And can we work with our multinational corporations and others to do things that we really can't do as a government? And the answer is yes. So when I give a talk like this to the State Department, one of the things that inevitably comes up is that we need a new rules for diplomacy. Like right now, Apple and America have aligned interests regarding China. Why can't we do something more than just sort of pinky wave at each other? Right? Can we work together in some sort of alliance structure? Right now, the State Department is, I sort of joke that DoD is very 20th century grounded. The State Department is like 19th century grounded. They're thinking concert of Europe and Metternich and bow ties and state-on-state engagements. But I think we need to be clear that maybe we should think about industrial diplomacy in a way that's more than just a buzzword, but an operational theory that diplomats learn in FSI, in sort of diplomatic school. All right, other questions. Do you think that Putin has not yet resorted to chem bio in Ukraine? Why? Okay, why do you think he will? It's a great question. It's a good question. I don't know about bio. I think that I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think when it comes to WMD with Putin, I think a lot of experts will sit here and pontificate about what they think will happen, but I think inevitably their predictions are no better than chance. So I don't want to get in that habit myself. Using WMD has a taboo around it that results in even more pariah status. And it's the question really to how much appetite Putin would have for bringing Russia to that pariah status, and would his inner circle, who's pretty pissed off at him, would they tolerate that? And if he did do something like that, that would be a great opportunity for American sneaky war to have him replaced. So one of the things I didn't talk about in this brief, but it's like I talk about American sort of stratagems for American sneaky war. One way to do it a good way to do it is how autocracies exploit American democracy and open society by hacking our election, by doing disinformation. Well, Americans are more vulnerable to that, but they're also, democracies are more vulnerable, but they're also more resilient. Autocracies are more powerful, but they're also more brittle. So let's bring the hurt to them, and use the regime type against them. So autocracies, their regime type, as you know, it's not even a pyramid of power. It's more like a telephone pole of power. And at the very top is, the autocrat and his lieutenants. And that autocrat at the top, I guarantee you, is always worried about his life survivability. Because autocracies end only two ways: either a body bag, or you die in your sleep like Castro. So if we can covertly manipulate it so that Putin thinks some of his lieutenants are going to have a palace coup, he will take them out for us, right? So this is an opportunity for American sneaky war. Not easy to do, but neither is anything in warfare. So I think it's something, if he did that or was going to do that, we could, maybe there's an opportunity for sneaky war to use this as because is there is there an opportunity for some generals or Prigozhin or whoever wants to sort of replace Putin? Could we give them an in somehow? All right, next slide. Next question. Okay, short of Armageddon, nuclear weapons. I think nuclear weapons may occur in our lifetime. There's no reason to think that the nuclear taboo will last another 70 years. And once it does, it may just be seen as a big bomb. There's a question of what does limited nuclear war look like? It's even more theoretical than cyber war. And one of my concerns, and I'm sure this is one of your concerns, is that nobody has really, outside of this community, has really thought deeply about WMD since the 1980s. And this has led to a strategic lacuna of ideas that's very dangerous right now. And what's even worse is that you have all these think tank experts and others who 2 years ago they were Syria experts, they became China experts, and now they're WMD experts, right? And they're not adding value add to the strategic conversation. And I think what we need is expertise that can go beyond just the community. So if I was to implore one thing from this conference is, how do we reach out beyond the community to share your knowledge for those who need to know it most, which is not an easy task, especially in Washington, D.C., which sometimes feels like a fifth grade classroom. People trying to shout over each other. But I think there's a big lacuna. I work at Fort McNair. The Weapons of Mass Destruction Center there is being thinned out, amazingly enough. So I think that we need to imagine a world where there is nuclear weapons, where that becomes a norm of warfare again, and lateral escalation becomes an issue. And hopefully not a nuclear 1914 Sarajevo moment. All right, next questions. If I was in charge, what would I do to deter or delay China's invasion in Taiwan? Well, this is a great question. So what I would do is, if we want China out of picking on Taiwan, we have to stick to that grand strategy I mentioned of, you got to get China more prioritizing its internal security above its expeditionary warfare. How do we do that? Well, we can do a couple things. We could be very aggressive, like I said, and we could try to create the perception of a palace coup within the communist ranks, and he sort of takes them out for us, or they take him out for us. Two is, again, the republics on the border of China have ancient enmity towards China. So let's do security force assistance, diplomatic assistance with them. Let's do other things too, like disinformation. Can we put a wedge between the population and the CCP? Can we exploit things like the recent COVID, rebellion, if you will? Can we somehow covertly or overtly support that, or color revolutions? Anything that we can do to get the priority, that we're going to change the calculus of thinking away from Taiwan and into those things, I think would be more successful. And yes, doing things we're doing like FONOPS, but Also, demonstrating that any sort of invasion would be a mass casualty event for them. Next slide. All right. So, as the impact of fewer overseas students coming to the West, I would disagree with that. So some of my Georgetown colleagues are like, well, if we just get like the sons and daughters of the elite to Georgetown, we'll change their way of their perspective. And that's never really quite worked out that way. I remember that I did my Ph.D. at London School of Economics, and one of our students was the son of Gaddafi. He wrote this dissertation on the power of democracy, and then there he was in 2011, squashing the democratic movement. So I think there's a lot of magical thinking in the academic world, something probably you're familiar with. I would say this, is that I think for sneaky war, what we should do is we should say that, Chinese and Russian students can come to America. We have the best universities in the world. Why wouldn't they do that? But the sons and daughters of the elite cannot. The sons and daughters, like Xi Jinping's daughter went to Harvard. Not because she's really good, but because check swiping and, prestige and stuff like that. If we said, no, you've got to go to University of Hanoi instead, and all her friends are going to Stanford and Harvard and Yale and wherever, she gets pissed off and yells at her father for us. That's a good thing, right? That's a good thing. Let's weaponize that. And we shouldn't feel bad for those kids, because, some of you, I went to some of these elite schools, and there are people there, you're like, there's no way you got in here because of merit. No way. And we should, those kids are elites. They're treated differently from womb to tomb, and they don't deserve pity. We should, and they're taking up spots of more deserving students from China, from Russia, from wherever. So I think we should be more clever, and we should be a little bit more, a little bit more cunning in how we deploy our power, our attraction, soft power. All right, next slide. Maybe there's no more slides. We've answered all the questions. Does anybody want to ask a question out there, and then I'll answer it, and then we're almost out of time? Oh, we do have one. Okay, final audience question. In light of what you have said this morning, what should victory in Ukraine look like? Oh my goodness. Well, first of all, it's up to Ukrainians. It's not up to us. We know that, right? I think that what might happen is that Russia, we don't know what's going to happen with Putin, but I think one way this could resolve in Russia's favor is if they make Ukraine into a landlocked country, where 3 sides of it are Russian territory, and one side, the western border, is Europe, and they just cook Ukraine. They make life hard for them for the next couple of years until Ukraine sort of capitulates in some way or another, or something like that happens. And so I think what we have to do is make Ukraine, this is a USG perspective, we have to make Ukraine into Russia's modern, Russia-Afghan war, where it becomes a quagmire, bleeds them dry, bankrupts them, and challenges their political regime's legitimacy and authority. And then we shake that cage with sneaky war and exploit the chaos that comes out the other end. Now, our government's not very comfortable about, exploiting in real time opportunities like that. We like to have very set plans, but I think we need to get more into the dark arts and less into the light sciences. And so I think what we can do is to help Ukraine ultimately is to try to get this regime, this sort of neo-czar regime, back into a box. And so they're no longer thinking about how do we take the Baltics, how do we reestablish an empire. We show that that's futile, and I think that doesn't just help Ukraine. It helps all the republics who are at one point under some either czarist or Soviet umbrella. So I think for Ukraine, their victory is kind of tied to American support, Because if America leaves its support, then a lot of NATO countries will also leave. And I think that then they find themselves very isolated in their fight against Russia, and I think that resources are against them. But that's just my opinion. But I think it's our combination of some sneaky war without putting our troops on the ground with Russian troops to avoid World War III because of WMD. WMD is the critical difference in this type of warfare than, say, the last 20 years of war. Our country has forgotten. It's had a generational pass on thinking of WMD, right, generationally. And now it's a thing again. And like my Georgetown students, who many of whom, shocking, were born after 9/11, they think of the Cold War like the Peloponnesian War. They have no idea what this means. So, and they're talking about, should we have like a no-fly zone and other catastrophic things like that. So we have a dearth of WMD strategic thinking that needs to be filled. And you are in a great position to help inform our national security establishment about that. And don't rely on think tanks to do the heavy lifting, because then you'll have to live with that result. I say that as a member of a think tank. I should probably not say that. That should be an inside voice moment, but there it is. So thank you very much. I hope it sounds like you've had a great week, and I want you to think a little bit about the future of war and how it may not be what the current sort of groupthink is, and how do we prepare for it? And how do you prepare for it? And how do you help make our country better prepared for it? Thank you very much.